Well, the prosecution rested this afternoon. Then the defense attorneys filed a motion for a finding of not guilty, which the judge denied that motion. So now the case moves forward. Now, before all of this happened, it was a very lengthy cross-examination of the lead NCIS, that is, investigator in this case. Defense attorneys tried to paint a picture of NCIS Special Agent Joseph Warpinski as a biased investigator who zeroed in on Chief Eddie Gallagher very early in this case and only gathered facts that fit his belief Chief Gallagher is guilty. Defense attorney Mark Mulcahy pointed out there's no scientific proof the stabbing of the ISIS detainee even took place. He also pointed out discrepancies between what Warpinski wrote in his reports and what was said during videotaped interviews. He brought up text messages Warpinski exchanged with witnesses giving his opinion about the case. During redirect with prosecutors, Warpinski testified that some of the SEAL witnesses were afraid of Chief Gallagher, and that in a private Facebook group, Gallagher asked fellow warfare members to post the names of witnesses testifying against him. Warpinski says at no point during any interviews did Navy SEAL Corey Scott tell anyone from NCIS he was the one who killed the ISIS detainee. He also told the jury 12 members of the platoon declined to be interviewed for this case. The last witness called today was another NCIS investigator who extracted data from Chief Gallagher's phone. She testified there were text message conversations between him and other SEALs. One of those included a photo of the deceased ISIS detainee, and Gallagher wrote, quote, "Got a good story with this. I got him with my hunting knife." And defense attorneys pointed out that those text messages were part of a much longer chain of text messages with Navy SEALs. Now, the jury will be back in court tomorrow as the defense begins to present its case.